Think about the last time you woke up and your stomach already felt tired, not hungry, not sick, just tired, heavy, like it had been working all night and never got to rest. If you're over 60, you probably know that feeling better than you'd like to. And here's the strange part. You've done everything right. More water, more fiber, maybe a probiotic capsule with breakfast. And somehow the fullness is still there by 10 in the morning. The question worth asking isn't what you're eating wrong. It's whether anyone has ever explained what's actually changing inside your body after 60, because most people never hear the real answer. And that gap in understanding is exactly why so many well-intentioned habits quietly fail. This isn't a story about a miracle fix. It's a story about a fluid your body has been making since the day you were born, one you've probably never thought about, and what happens when it starts slowing down without anyone telling you. Let's start with the body itself, because the truth is almost always more interesting than the myth. Deep inside your abdomen, your liver produces something called bile, a thick, greenish-yellow fluid that does one of the most underappreciated jobs in the entire digestive system. It's stored in the gallbladder, and every time fat enters your small intestine, bile is released to break that fat into smaller, absorbable pieces. Without it, fat would simply pass through your body unprocessed, dragging nutrients, energy, and comfort along with it. But here's what most people don't realize. Bile isn't just about fat. It also helps push waste through your intestines by supporting the natural muscular contractions of the gut, a process called peristalsis. It helps keep bacterial populations in balance, and it plays a quiet, constant role in clearing out substances your body no longer needs, including excess cholesterol. In other words, bile isn't a side character in digestion. It's closer to the stage manager, making sure everything moves the way it should, when it should. Now here's where the story turns. As we age, often starting sometime in the mid-50s and continuing through the 60s and beyond, the liver's bile output can gradually decline. The gallbladder itself may become less responsive, contracting less efficiently when it's called upon. This isn't something that shows up dramatically on a standard blood test. It isn't announced. It simply happens quietly, in the background, the way so many aging processes do. And because it's gradual, it's easy to miss the connection between this internal shift and the very visible, very frustrating symptoms that follow. So what does a slowdown in bile actually feel like from the outside? For many people, it doesn't feel like one problem. It feels like 3 separate ones. There's the bloating that doesn't seem tied to anything you ate, the kind that's present even before breakfast, immune to whatever dietary change you try next. There's a shift in how your body holds weight, especially around the midsection, even when the number on the scale hasn't moved much. And there's a general sense of sluggishness in digestion itself, a feeling that things aren't moving the way they used to, that your gut requires more effort than it once did. Most people treat these 3 things as unrelated complaints of getting older, but there's a compelling case grounded in basic digestive physiology that all 3 can trace back to the same underlying mechanism, a gut that isn't receiving enough of the bile it needs to function at full capacity. Here's the deeper mechanism worth understanding. When bile production dips, dietary fat isn't broken down as completely as it should be. Some of that undigested fat interacts with bacteria in your gut in ways that produce excess gas, which is a direct physical contributor to bloating. At the same time, a slower bile flow means slower peristalsis, and slower peristalsis means material sits in the intestine longer than it should. That extended dwell time gives certain bacterial populations more opportunity to ferment leftover material, which can shift the balance of your gut microbiome in ways that aren't ideal. None of this happens overnight. It builds, slowly, over months and years, which is exactly why it's so easy to normalize as simply getting older, instead of recognizing it as a specific physiological shift with a specific cause. This is the point where it's worth pausing to be fair to the advice you've probably already tried, because none of it is wrong. Fiber genuinely helps move material through the gut and feeds beneficial bacteria. Hydration genuinely supports stool consistency and overall gut comfort. Probiotics genuinely can help rebalance bacterial populations. The issue isn't that these things don't work. The issue is what they don't do. None of them directly stimulates bile production. Adding more fiber to a gut that isn't processing fat efficiently is a bit like adding more traffic to a road that already has a bottleneck further down. You're increasing the volume, moving toward the problem, not clearing the problem itself. And a probiotic introduced into an environment still struggling with incomplete fat breakdown may simply have less room to do its job well because the underlying terrain hasn't changed. So what does help stimulate the mechanism that's actually slowing down? This is where diet, and specifically dietary fat itself, becomes surprisingly relevant, and where a common misconception needs to be corrected. Most people assume that eating less fat is the safer choice as they age, especially if digestion already feels sluggish, but the physiology tells a more nuanced story. When the right kind of fat reaches your small intestine, it triggers the release of a hormone called cholecystokinin, often shortened to CCK, which signals your gallbladder to contract and release its stored bile. In other words, dietary fat isn't the enemy of a slowing digestive system. Under the right circumstances, it can actually be the signal that wakes it back up. This doesn't mean any fat in any amount at any time will help. Context matters enormously, and this is where real, evidence-informed choices come in, rather than blanket rules. Extra virgin olive oil has one of the stronger bodies of research behind it when it comes to supporting healthy bile flow and gut motility. It's rich in oleic acid, a monounsaturated fat that appears to trigger a sustained release of cholecystokinin when it reaches the small intestine on a relatively empty stomach, meaning its effect isn't a brief spike, but something that can extend across a meaningful portion of the day's digestive window. Research on Mediterranean dietary patterns, which use olive oil as a primary fat source, has repeatedly linked regular consumption to improved gut microbial diversity, reduced markers of intestinal inflammation, and better reported digestive comfort. The distinction that matters here is quality. Extra virgin, cold-pressed olive oil retains far more of its active plant compounds, its polyphenols, than heavily refined versions labeled simply olive oil or light, which have typically been processed with heat and chemical extraction that strip much of what makes the oil functionally useful in the first place. Medium-chain triglycerides, more commonly known as MCTs, offer a different but complementary mechanism. Unlike long-chain fats, which require heavy bile emulsification before they can be absorbed, medium-chain fats are absorbed more directly and shuttled to the liver more quickly. That rapid delivery appears to send the liver a signal that active fat metabolism is underway, which can, in turn, support increased bile acid output. Some people notice a difference within days rather than weeks, though MCT oil also tends to be more intense on the digestive system in higher amounts, which is why a gradual introduction, starting with a small amount and slowly increasing over a couple of weeks, tends to be the more comfortable and sustainable approach, rather than jumping in with a large dose right away. Flaxseed oil works through a gentler, more structural pathway. It's rich in alpha-linolenic acid, a plant-based omega-3, and beyond its cardiovascular benefits, it appears to help coat and support the intestinal lining itself. For a gut that has been dealing with slower transit and the low-grade irritation that can accompany incomplete fat processing over time, that lubricating, protective quality can matter, even if flaxseed oil isn't a particularly strong bile stimulant on its own. Its contribution tends to show up gradually, often over a few weeks, in the form of more regular and more comfortable bowel movements. Virgin coconut oil brings something different to the picture entirely, largely because of a compound called lauric acid, which makes up roughly half the fat content in high-quality, unrefined coconut oil. Some research suggests lauric acid may help disrupt bacterial biofilms, organized colonies of bacteria that can adhere to the intestinal wall and interfere with normal motility. Coconut oil also appears to have a direct, if modest, effect on gut motility through pathways separate from bile stimulation, along with some antimicrobial properties that may be useful in a gut environment where fermentation has become more common than it should be. As with olive oil, quality is a defining factor. Refined coconut oil, especially the odorless, light varieties sold in clear bottles, has typically had much of its lauric acid content altered or removed during processing. Black seed oil, derived from Nigella sativa, rounds out the picture as more of a supportive, protective agent than a direct bile stimulant. It has a genuine and fairly long research history, particularly around reducing intestinal inflammation and offering antioxidant protection to the gut lining. It's a reasonable addition for someone dealing with ongoing gut irritation, but it isn't going to meaningfully accelerate bile production or intestinal transit on its own. It plays more of a maintenance role than a resetting one. None of these oils function as a switch that flips a slowing digestive system back to where it was decades ago. What the research does support is something more modest and, frankly, more believable, that the right dietary fats, taken thoughtfully, at the right time, in reasonable quality and quantity, can support a bile production system that has simply become quieter with age, the same way gentle, consistent exercise can support joints that have become stiffer, without pretending to reverse the years themselves. Timing turns out to matter almost as much as which oil you choose. The bile-stimulating effect of dietary fat depends heavily on it reaching the small intestine without competing against a large volume of other food. Taking olive oil drizzled over a big breakfast, mixed into a smoothie loaded with other ingredients, or poured onto toast alongside eggs and bread dilutes the specific signal you're trying to send. Many of the studies looking at oleic acid and cholecystokinin release focus on consumption on a relatively empty stomach, which is a meaningfully different physiological moment than consumption alongside a full meal. Similarly, taking a fiber supplement at the exact same time as a bile-supporting oil can interfere with absorption, since certain fibers bind to fatty acids in ways that reduce how much of that fat actually reaches the intestinal wall to trigger a hormonal response. Spacing these out, even by an hour, appears to matter more than most people assume. There's also a psychological layer to all of this worth sitting with for a moment, because it explains why so many people give up on dietary changes before they've had a real chance to work. Digestive changes, unlike a headache or a sore muscle, don't resolve in a day. The gut microbiome takes time to shift. Bile production patterns take time to respond to new dietary signals. Most meaningful research on dietary fat and gut motility measures outcomes over weeks, not days. But most people, understandably, want to feel a difference almost immediately, and when they don't, they conclude the approach isn't working and move on to the next thing. Probiotics, then a cleanse, then a different fiber blend, cycling through interventions without ever giving any single one enough time to actually engage with the mechanism it's meant to support. This isn't a failure of willpower, it's simply a mismatch between how quickly we expect our bodies to respond and how quickly biological systems actually change. It's also worth being honest about what this conversation is not. It is not a suggestion that digestive discomfort in older adults is always, or even usually, explained by bile alone. Persistent bloating, unexplained abdominal changes, or ongoing digestive discomfort can have many causes, some of them worth ruling out with a physician, including issues with the gallbladder itself, thyroid function, medication side effects, or other conditions that genuinely require medical evaluation rather than dietary adjustment. Anyone on medications that affect liver function, gallbladder function, or blood thinning should talk with their doctor before making significant changes to dietary fat intake, since certain oils and certain medications can interact in ways that aren't obvious from the outside. Nothing here is meant to replace that conversation. If anything, understanding the mechanism should make that conversation more useful, not less necessary, because you'll be able to ask sharper, more specific questions. What makes this particular piece of physiology worth knowing isn't that it offers a shortcut. It's that it offers an explanation. And for a lot of people dealing with digestive changes after 60, the explanation itself is the missing piece. There's a particular kind of relief that comes from realizing your body isn't malfunctioning randomly. It's running a specific, well-documented process at reduced capacity, the same way an engine that's been driven for 60 years runs a little quieter than one fresh off the line, not because something is broken, but because certain components simply produce less than they once did. Understanding that doesn't fix everything. But it does turn a vague, frustrating feeling, my body is off and I don't know why, into something concrete enough to actually work with. If there's one thing worth carrying away from all of this, it isn't a single oil or a single number of tablespoons. It's the idea that so much of what we accept as an inevitable part of aging is actually a specific, describable, and in many cases, supportable biological process. One that responds gradually and modestly to the right kind of attention. Your gut at 65 isn't the same gut you had at 30, and it was never going to be. But quieter isn't the same as finished, and slower isn't the same as broken. Sometimes the most useful thing science can offer isn't a cure. It's simply a better question to ask the next time your body tells you something has changed, and the patience to listen to the answer instead of rushing past it toward whatever claims to fix it fastest.